From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. It happens every 4 years. The national media, which is increasingly urban and coastal, descends on the middle of the country in a pitched last-minute bid to understand the mind of the rural voter. I've lived in so-called red states, states with histories of voting for Republican candidates, for most of my adult life. So I've seen this frustrating cycle repeat and repeat. The media rushes in, unprepared and lacking context, and despite the good faith efforts of quality reporters, rural America is once again oversimplified and reduced to a set of easy cliches. With that in mind, and as a kind of corrective, I assembled the summer 2024 issue of Switchyard magazine and hosted a series of accompanying talks at the Switchyard Festival in Tulsa last May. My hope is that our contributors present a richer, more complex version of rural America, or rather, multiple rural Americas. Inevitably, many of the topics are serious, but the discussions are lively, funny, searching, and driven by hope. In this live audience episode, I sit down with 3 contributors to the Rural Americas issue of Switchyard magazine. Monica Potts, the New York Times bestselling author of The Forgotten Girls; Dean Bakopoulos, whose 3rd novel, Summerlong, is now in development as a television series; and Michael Croley, the author of the collection of stories Any Other Place, winner of the James Still Award from the Fellowship of Southern Writers. All 3 contributors discuss their essays about the dream and myths of living in small towns, the difficulties rural America faces today, and where they see hope for the future. For the purpose of today's discussion, I'm going to start a little bit out of order. I'm going to start with Dean, because your essay, it seems to me, is an interesting starting point because it talks about the dream, the made-up version of small-town America, of rural America that was given to us by Hollywood. And you didn't grow up in a rural setting, but you dreamed, you yearned for the rural setting because of that invented version. Tell us a little bit about this essay and about that vision of the small-town America that you describe.
Sure. Thanks, Ted. Thanks, everyone, for coming in on a beautiful day. And also, first time in Tulsa, pretty delightful place. And Ted is an editor I've respected for 20 years now. Last time we did something, we ended up at the National Magazine Awards. So let's hope you're on a hot streak. Yeah. But really, there's so few venues like Switchyard that are respecting artists and allowing us to experiment and compensating us fairly. That feels revolutionary. It seems like you may take it for granted being locals, but what do they say in the business? It's a disruptor. Switchyard is changing things, I think. So thank you, Ted, and thank you all. I grew up in Detroit, kid of immigrants. My mom's from Ukraine. My dad's from Greece. Both came here. My mom is a refugee. My dad escaping a political situation during the coup in '67 in Athens. And I grew up in Detroit. We never really left Detroit. We didn't have vacations. And it was through It's a Wonderful Life, which my essay is about, and the Andy Griffith Show, that I think I learned about what America was like when you weren't living in an urban immigrant enclave. And this thing I started to dream about because of these 2 depictions, and almost obsessively, that I would not really feel peace till I got to a small town. So that's what I'm wrestling with in the essay, is how these myths that every country has its myth. I think America has myths that demand monetization and action, and you believe you can buy your way into the myth. So that all coalesced with this immigrant's idea of success, of drive, of working hard. And that's what the essay tried to tackle.
That's great. And Monica Potts and Mike Croley, you're, of course, coming at this from the opposite perspective. You're talking from intimate first-person experience of living in rural areas and small towns and confronting some of the challenges that face those communities, and in many cases have seemingly gotten worse and perhaps have gotten worse as the effects of depopulation. We've talked a lot about the information silos that exist, but there's a kind of self-sorting that is happening in the country as well, where now the people who have left small towns have left behind people who are perhaps okay with some of what has been most insular and most difficult about small town life. The two issues, just so that I can give it in thumbnail, but I want you each to discuss it in more detail. Monica, you're taking on this question of rural healthcare, and in particular, this challenge of aging in place in rural areas. As healthcare is improving and people are living longer, that means that there's a longer period that people are living in that isolation and with those scant resources. Mike, your essay is pretty directly about racism and about the bigotry that still lives in a lot of small town America. So I wonder, just in dialogue with some of what Dean has set up for us. I mean, these are the images that we have. We have this It's a Wonderful Life, and we have this vision of Mayberry. And especially one of the things that got to me in Dean's essay is this notion that you're known in a small town, and that because you're known, everyone takes care of each other, and that everyone is looking out for each other. And that's the great thing about being there. And I think that both of you in your own ways demonstrate that's not really the case. And especially now, people are more and more on their own. Monica, if you could talk a little bit about, just give an overview of your essay from the issue.
So I am thinking about this a lot, and because my own mother is 74, she still lives in my hometown in very rural Arkansas. And we do have that stereotype that neighbors take care of you in small towns. Everybody knows each other. There's this great community that comes together. And I haven't found that to be true. I found that towns like mine in Arkansas are aging more and more. There's a more and more isolated population that is older, and they don't have the means and resources to really take care of each other because it's hard to get around and houses are far apart, and there aren't central downtowns in the way there used to be in those small towns. Everything's developed along these bigger highways with big box stores and Walmarts, which have replaced what used to be the heart of these small towns. So we have this idea that neighbors chip in, but if you never see your neighbors, if you're far from your neighbors, it's hard for them to literally see you, then that's harder to do. And then the other thing about small towns too is just that the younger population has really fled very rural America. So they're living in cities like Tulsa. They're living in cities close to home, but far enough away that it's hard to take care of their families. So if you're talking about someone who needs help with their day-to-day life and their adult children live as much as an hour and a half away, that might as well be across the other side of the moon. It's just too far for taking care of people. So thinking about what to do with rural America as we're continuing to age, the youngest boomers turn 60 this year, it's really going to reshape the way that we think about these things and how we take care of our aging population.
Yeah, I grew up in a small town in southeastern Kentucky, and I think that idea of being known cuts two ways. Sometimes you do have a good community that will watch out for you and be there for you. I think in the instance of us, my mother's Korean, and that made my brother and me like one of one in the town. So we were always on the outs, it felt like. And I think that being known that way was not always a positive thing. And to Dean's essay a little bit, I think for a long time, I thought my childhood was pretty good. And then I just started reflecting back on things as I got older and became an adult. And I realized how strange it was where I'd grown up. And it was kind of odd because when I became an adult and moved away, people would always ask me, what was it like growing up there? And it was obvious to them that it had to be weird, but it wasn't obvious to me at first. And then as I got older, I started thinking about it. And there were a lot of oddities about having an immigrant mother, having an Asian mother in a place like that. And it wasn't that I wasn't necessarily aware of it growing up, but just the weirdness of it when I reflected back on it. Jokes that people would make, really honestly well-meaning jokes, but then being an adult and being like, you were like 30 telling a 12-year-old that probably wasn't the best move. Just stuff like that, I think, was an interesting experience for me. And I try to be really careful about how I talk about rural America because I haven't lived in my hometown since I was 18. But I go back to see my parents, and I think things have shifted and things have changed. Monica's essay really resonated with me. My parents are in their 70s. They don't have anyone to help them. I don't live close by. They're not the kinds of people that reach out for help unless they really, really have to, but they'd rather not do that. So I think that idea of being known in some ways, it hurt us in my instance, but it also helped. And I put this in the essay. My mom's very clear about that. She's like, not everyone was bad to us. And I think she thinks I paint my experience a little too negatively sometimes.
So picking up on that part of it, I mean, it seems to me that each one of your essays to some degree is about alienation and about what happens when you realize that these towns, and Monica's, you've described beautifully, that not just the towns, but the dissolving towns that are not really fully towns anymore, aren't functional in that way, that there is not just this sense of isolation, but as I say, alienation, when you realize that the identity that's been attached to this is unraveling. And Mike, as you say, it makes you look back and reconsider everything about these communities and to what extent they were really communities at all. I'm just wondering if each of you can talk about this.
Yeah, well, my hometown was part of a documentary series that was done around 2007 or 2008 by Elliot Jaspin, NPR. And it was a series of episodes about sundown towns. And Corbin, Kentucky, where I grew up, had been one of those towns. And one of the things that Jaspin talks about in that series is that towns like this develop what is called a fable to explain why no black people live in that town. And our fable was a lie. I think the story was supposedly a black man had robbed someone, and then basically a mob formed and they marched all the black people out of town. And we all grew up with that myth. And I think one of the reckonings I've had to have as an adult is, which is something my mom lives with too, like being in between cultures. So my mom doesn't really feel American. She doesn't really feel Korean anymore. And I would say that I think I largely grew up identifying as white, although also not really. But all my friends were white. All the guys I played sports with were white. So you kind of adopt that culture, even though you always feel on the outside of it. And I think that sense alienation has grown stronger as I've gotten older, because in many ways, knowing where I grew up, I had this weird past that I was always accepted until something went wrong during a game and then I wasn't accepted. You just grow up not really feeling tethered to this idea of community and home, and what I watched on Andy Griffith very lovingly on reruns too. And you think, well, that's what my town's supposed to be like, but it didn't always feel that way. And it certainly didn't feel that way for my mother many times over in her life, and well after she had established herself in the community and in her church, especially when we thought things were getting better, I guess would be a way to put it. So I think that alienation is really difficult to find footing in a place where everyone knows you and you can't escape it either. I think that was the other thing for us, just to finish, was just that I think my mother always felt watched. And that's a really tough way to live your life, to feel like everyone's always looking at you and asking you things and wanting your opinion about things because of how you look, less than who you are.
And I wanted to ask on exactly that subject, that there is this interesting dichotomy with small towns, that it seems that people who are determined to get away, people who feel this is their community and that this is the place that they're committed to forever. My dad came from a microscopic town in the middle of nowhere in western Nebraska, and he always said that everybody in town believed in the flat earth. And he said the reason for it was that anytime their kids drove past the horizon, they never came back. But one of the things that I think is fascinating is the question then of when you have family that's there. I mean, so much of your story is this story of trying to escape this gravitational pull. And you can do that to some extent when you're young and your parents are still capable and all of those sorts of things. But then that inevitably changes over time.
I think that's right. And I grew up in this small town in northern Arkansas, and I left for college and I was away for 20 years. And I returned in 2018 and lived there for 5 years again before I recently left again. And during that time, I just became aware of how much help I could give my mom if I was near her. And I saw other people too. There were some families whose kids never left. They lived within a 5-mile radius of them, but more and more people whose families and children and grandchildren were all very far away. And just thinking about the effort it takes for somebody who's older to think about leaving. For my mom, she has a house that is the entirety of her wealth that she has to try to sell in this small town where it's just not worth much. So that's all of her retirement. And I think about that a lot with older people, and just also also thinking about, my mom was a bit of an outsider because of her beliefs. She wasn't very religious in this very religious town. And I think small towns are cruel to people who are outsiders when the way that they want to live is outside of the norm as well as people who are outsiders in all different kinds of ways. I feel like small towns just don't accept and adjust to people who don't fit what they think their idea of life should be. And I think my mom would be so much happier if she left. But it's just this grinding effort. We've spent the last 2 years to try to get her to move and unravel her life. And nobody wants to go back. I don't want to go back again and take care of her. So I'm not sure what we're going to do as that continues to happen across rural America. It's graying, it's getting older, and it's slowly unraveling in a lot of places.
Well, as you say, it's fascinating because like this dream of home ownership, that the home then becomes the anchor that makes it impossible to leave that and impossible to give that up. Dean, you've written about a version of that as well, that from a distance, that seemed like the dream also. Like, what I want is this charming historic home that's in the countryside. Tell us a little about how that worked out.
Well, I lost the home. I grew up with exile and displacement being the dominant metaphors. We were living in a place because we had to leave the other places. My parents met here, but they both, especially my mother, the Ukrainian side of the family, it was a forced exile. My grandparents had been in Buchenwald. My mom was in utero there, was born in a ditch outside of Buchenwald shortly after the liberation of it. So she grew up first 5 years in a refugee camp. So there was something, I think, that was instilled in me of like, you have to find your piece of paradise and protect it. That really has been the dominant metaphor of my life, trying to find a place where nothing bad could ever happen to me and my children. Well, you can't do that, obviously. But I have chosen to live in the rural Midwest my entire adult life, pretty much, with a few short stints for graduate school and stuff. Right now, I live outside of Iowa City in a little town that's becoming a suburb pretty quickly. There's still a volunteer fire department there. And I'm working currently on a television project about volunteer firefighters in the rural Midwest. And in some of the interviews I've been doing and some of the people I've been talking to, there are these infrastructures that were very civic minded that were put in place in these towns to protect and to help. Some of them were rooted in churches. Some of them were funded by the county, by the tax rolls. Most of that funding is being pulled. Even the local colleges, which often invigorated small towns, small liberal arts schools or small satellite schools of a state university, are losing their resources. So taking it a little bit different direction, but like it really is hard to build a sustainable life in a small town if there aren't these places where you can work, if there isn't anyone to answer the 911 call. And one of the fire chiefs I spoke to said that young people, especially young men, in addition to being radicalized online because of that, because they're fed this thing of how corrupt the world is, this overstated conspiracy theory driven mistrust of all institutions, they're not volunteering to do the things that used to make small towns, at least a fantasy version of small town maybe, but that used to sustain small towns. So there's an entire generation, again, this is a big blanket statement, but there's an entire generation, he was speaking specifically of young men, who don't feel there's any reason to contribute. They hate everything. They think it's all corrupt. Anything that's funded by the county's got to be bad. So there's that little study of fire departments was really interesting to me, that they can't get young men to come put out a fire when your neighbor's house is on fire. That seems to me to be a shift that we haven't reckoned with, because as you write about so eloquently, the boomers are aging, and those are the ones who built up those fire departments and the volunteer library board and all the other things. I'm really interested in why is it so hard to build a sustainable life for young people in a small town? I don't think they just are fleeing because the big city is so great. I think that they look around and things feel like they're not sustainable there.
That leads directly to my next question. I mentioned my dad in the tiny town that he grew up in. The last time he was there, I dragged him there so that I would have an epilogue for my book. I was like, let's look around at the sad remains of the place you grew up. And I truly was saddened by it, that all the places that I'd grown up hearing about, the school was closed, the houses that he had lived in were caving in. And for me, probably most difficult was that the community center, which had been an old CCC building that had been built there, and his dad had done so much work there that they renamed it for him, that was in total disrepair. And I said kind of absentmindedly, I was like, this is sad to see what's happened here. And he said, yeah, is it? And this was his suggestion. He's like, maybe these places have served their purpose at a moment in American history, and now that purpose is gone, and it's time to move on to what's next. So this would be my question to you. Is there a way to revitalize small towns and make them into something that serves the purpose that they once did? Or is it time to abandon this kind of It's a Wonderful Life version of things and look to some new version of America?
That's a really good question I think about a lot too. When I was in Clinton all those years, I thought, why was this town put here? What is its continued purpose? And not in a negative way necessarily, but just really a real inquiry. And when you go back to the settling of just everything west of the Mississippi, that was a different world. The idea was that everybody would have their own farm. So they thought that they needed that land. And there's a whole other conversation we could have about how wrong it was to do that, because it was not our country to do that to. But that purpose definitely does not exist anymore. We're no longer an agrarian society. And you have really tiny towns all across the country where what is their purpose? What is their reason for being? And rural counties that revitalize themselves around arts or think about themselves as some kind of artistic escape tend to do really well. Rural counties that welcome new immigrants who want to have their own vision of rural America tend to do really well. Rural counties that have some really unique environmental quality to them and know how to capitalize on that and come together on figuring out how to market that and be a place for that do really well. But other places don't. So I do wonder if it's time to rethink how we occupy all of these spaces in this country, how they were settled, the wrongs of how they were settled, and whether it's time to think about a new way forward, taking all of that into account.
I might just add that to me, civic engagement has become something we can perform online. And I think this is true of the right, the left, the center. And I think the restoration of any community, broadly defined, including small towns, rests on a new definition of civic engagement, where we don't allow people at the very top of the political conversation to dictate how we're going to interact with our neighbors and what neighbors to be suspicious of and what neighbors are okay. I think that the reversal of how we engage civically has to be through small events where you get to meet people and talk to them. And until we find some way to dismantle, whether they're politicians or podcasters or whatever, who are dominating the political discourse and then making it feel as if you repost their stuff, you're civically engaged, until we can break that cycle somehow. And I don't have a great answer. I do feel like all communities are going to be watching their infrastructure, whether it's the civic infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure, the medical infrastructure, wobble. So civic engagement is this slippery term, but it is something that I think many people feel civically engaged, but they've been stoned on their couch the whole time, basically. So I don't know if the best thing to fix it is community events. I do think the arts are a huge part of that. And that's why I've worked in cultural nonprofits for most of my life when I'm not in the classroom, is trying to get people to things, to meet one more person that they live near. And I think it'll start that way.
I think they'll evolve the way they need to evolve, right? I mean, if your town is dying and you want to save it, people will figure out a way to save it. To your dad's point, maybe it serves its purpose. But I think particularly in my town is on I-75, which is an important distinction because Monica and I were talking, she worked in a county called Owsley County where you have to drive an hour and a half before you can think about going somewhere. And that's a big difference in some of those really isolated mountain communities in eastern Kentucky. They have to drive a long way before they can think about doing something else. And those are the towns that are more isolated and that are having a harder time giving people purpose, both men and women purpose in those towns. And you see that those towns, as coal continues to dry up, and that still remains a very contentious issue in all of those towns, what is our purpose? And it's not just the town I grew up in has a fairly good hospital. It's where everyone from eastern Kentucky goes first. And then if they have to go to Lexington or Knoxville, then they get transferred from there. But that's another problem, is that the medical industry is like the number one employer in almost every city, big or small, in this country, right? That doesn't seem to provide a lot of avenues for opportunity or civic engagement. So when I think about my hometown, what's happened there There have been some shifts. They've always been part of the railroad system. They're a hub on CSX, and that's always been a pretty good paying job. Those jobs are drying up, but the town has gotten more diverse. It's really odd to me that sometimes these guys that I went to high school with will post these photos of going to the high school football game, and there are now black players on the team, which I just cannot get over that sometimes. Like, it just stuns me every time I see them. Like, what is going on here? So I think there is an evolution in these towns, but I think the demand for purpose is what I would say is an important one, to Dean's point. But also, I don't know what the solution to that is, because we continue to create technology that takes people's purpose away. And I don't understand why, even if we're against it, we've all put a bet on that to a certain degree.
Well, and a great deal of the reporting I've done over the last 10 or 15 years has been in meatpacking towns, small towns that are entirely dependent on this single industry, just like that. And as that industry turned to undocumented labor and now to refugee labor, supplanting what had been the white labor that they had relied on before, there's a lot of animus in those towns and then abandonment in many of those towns by the white population. But one of the towns that I've had truly the misfortune of spending a lot of time in is Fremont, Nebraska. And Fremont, it's such a classic example of what you're talking about. It's a town that is maybe 45 minutes from Omaha, an hour from Lincoln. So anyone who's looking to escape, there are places to escape to that are pretty close by. But the thing that I heard over and over and over again in Fremont was, what we're trying to do is not turn into Schuyler, which is another town that was about 30 miles away. And they're like, go to Schuyler and see what's happened there. And that's what we're trying to avoid. First time I went to Schuyler, it's a town of 6,000 people that, yes, is probably 2/3 now people who were born in a single village in Guerrero in Mexico. But what I also see is that all of the storefronts on the main square are filled. There are multiple grocery stores. There are locally owned businesses. And to me, it's a fascinating thing to see places that fundamentally what they're saying is we're more committed to staying a white town than we are to being an economically thriving town. And I wonder if you can each talk about, I mean, Mike, your stuff is very directly on this topic, but the extent to which racism is an element of all of this that we sometimes try not to discuss, but is always lurking in the background, at least in the background, if not front and center.
Yeah, in the essay I wrote about, I think it was during Obama's first midterm election. So in a way, that doesn't feel that long ago, and the town has changed a little bit since then. But my mom goes to vote, and there's a misunderstanding. And a woman working at the polling station says to her, "You're in my country now. You need to be nice to me." And my mom looks around her, and she's like, "You're talking to me?" And my mom had lived in that town for 35 years. She'd raised 2 sons. She'd paid taxes, volunteered at a church for 25 years. And this woman had lived in our town for 6 months. And then my mom, around that time, she had started working at the hospital in the gift shop, started volunteering. My dad had retired, so she had to get out of the house, as you guys all know how that goes. So she volunteered at the hospital. Then she started working there, and she was pretty entrepreneurial, and they ended up hiring her. And so she found real purpose in doing that. But then these people would come into the store, and my mom's got a really interesting accent. She's still, I would say, to people that don't know her, it's a pretty deeply Korean accent, but she also sounds like a hillbilly. So it's a really weird, people are like, what's going on over there, you know? And these old country boys from counties deep in eastern Kentucky would come in there and they'd try to take advantage of her, thinking that she was dumber than she was. And then they didn't realize that my cousin worked in the police force. And then my cousin would show up. What happened to me over time, when I think about the racism in that town, is that there was overt stuff like that. And then there was like the not overt stuff. And a big change for me was the poet Claudia Rankin wrote this book called Citizen. And she tells this story about being in a Walgreens, waiting in line to get her prescription. And this guy just walks past her and he goes, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't see you." And I think she intends it to be like it was, like he just didn't see her. But she repeats the line in the book over and over. "I didn't see you, I didn't see you, I didn't see you, I didn't see you." And that's how people were to my mom. So my friends would ride with her to games, and their parents would say, like, "I don't see you as Korean. I see you as you. I see you as Beck." And as I got older, I was like, well, then you're not seeing her. You know, to see her is you have to see her as a Korean woman who moved to this country at 19, taught herself English, raised 2 kids in this small little town where she was not welcomed, where she was not welcomed by her mother-in-law, where she was not welcomed by my dad's family. And she overcame all that. And you have to see people in their totality. So to some of the reporting that you have been doing, Ted, and that we talk about a lot when we get together, it's like the way towns will thrive and evolve. And I got this from our friend Alan Shapiro, is whatever your hyphen is, Asian American, African American, whatever your hyphen, that's where your most American is, whatever that hyphen is. And when you try to build walls to shelter yourself from other cultures, that's when the cultures die. You have to embrace all of it, and then you can get back to purpose and civic engagement and all those things. But I think that deep seed of racism, especially in my town, and that's why it's hard for me to see those pictures online of black kids in uniforms, because I just can't get that out of my mind of like what it was like growing up there, which is probably a moral failing on my part. But I think that that's a really hard thing for generations to overcome. And I feel like she still gets that. I think she's always been on guard. And it's a hard thing to watch your mother always be on guard and know that she can't leave, right? Whereas I was able to.
Yeah, I think my town wasn't on an official sundown town list, but I had to go to other towns as an adult to learn about what my county had done, which was after the Civil War, former slaves moved west and they tried to settle in places like Arkansas, to some extent Oklahoma, states further west and territories further west to claim land and farm. And there had been a small community in my county and they were driven south through violence. And the Ozarks has a long history of a lot of racism and real violence to keep them white on purpose. It's very overt. I think it became very overt even more when Obama was elected. It remains so. And the things I hear people say are that we welcome immigrants, but only those that come in the quote unquote right way, or they draw these lines around the kinds of communities that they want to accept or the ways that they think that people can be accepted in the ways that people can't. And I don't know if you heard the Jason Aldean song, Try That in a Small Town. That was very popular in my hometown. I just want to make a note that he is from Macon, Georgia, which is a city, and it is not representative of small towns at all. But the fact that people feel that we're going to keep you out, we take care of our own, but who is that? They get to define that. They get to say who that is, and they get to determine who gets to live in what they feel is their town, and they want to preserve that image that they have of what makes an American and what makes this country what it is and what makes this ideal real life that they have, this image that they have in their head. And it's really so self-destructive. And it's one of those things that I see over and over. People from different cultures do try to settle in my home county. We have a small and growing Central American population. My partner lived with me in Arkansas, and he's Hispanic. He's Colombian and Cuban. And he really liked it at first, and he wanted to live in Arkansas, and he wanted to stay there. But a series of conversations, some of which were very overtly racist and some of which were just microaggressions over and over again, they just wore him down, and he felt like he had to fight all the time, and he was just always putting on a happy face. And he would say that to people, and their response would be, but it's not that bad here, right? And just this inability to hear the experiences of other people and think about what that means and try to change and grow just wasn't there. And that's why we gave up on it. And it was really sad for us to give up on living in Clinton, because we did want to stay close to my mom and all of the other things that I've written about and talked about. And it's home. I still probably wrongly love it in a lot of different ways. And we just couldn't make it happen. And I feel like that's what I want people in small towns that are reluctant to change and grow to know, is that you are going to lose people who want to try to make it there and who want to try to help that town survive and thrive if you don't loosen up and think about new ways and listen to experiences and confront your racism and your racist history. So it's something I think about a lot. Yeah.
And I think a central theme of It's a Wonderful Life is the idea of the one thing that probably unites every human on the planet is the yearning for peace. Most people actually, if you boil it down, all their differences, they would like a safe place to take care of their family or their partner, or you live alone, whatever their choice is, and to just have a peaceful life where it's not constantly feeling like you're fighting to stay afloat. And I think the communities that will reimagine themselves are ones where freedom is paramount. And it's something that seems so simple, that freedom is really the key. And I don't mean it in a political speech sort of way. I mean the freedom to be able to exist how you want to exist in the community you choose to exist in. And so much of political rhetoric falls apart if people accepted that. So I see the towns that I've lived in that were the most successful. One is Mineral Point, Wisconsin, which was an old mining town restored to this beautiful splendor by two men who were in a partnership in the 30s when this was hard to do in a small town. Openly, they weren't allowed to be married, but essentially married. But that added a whole element of acceptance into Mineral Point. That took time, and it's not Eden, but it's a simple example of when people come because they want to build a life, and whether they're there to work a meatpacking plant or work on a farm or open an art gallery, that acceptance is actually, I think, in our nature. That's the hopeful side of me. I think it's all the outside rhetoric that people depend on for power that makes us feel like that's not the case. But I actually think most people want to live in harmony with their neighbors. Life is just so much easier. So again, I think that It's a Wonderful Life had that beauty to it, which is probably why I fantasized about living there. Felt like everyone was living in this harmony. But nothing is built without an influx of energy in this country, probably anywhere, but for sure in America. Every urban neighborhood in Detroit that had a slump was revitalized by immigrants from Yemen, from Greece, from Ukraine, depending on the neighborhood. That's true of almost any city. And in cities, I think it's easier to welcome that in because the people who really have a problem with it just go to another part of the city, which is a whole nother issue. But I think in rural places, people feel often they have to defend that. And I don't know what the shift is going to be. The shift may be like living in harmony is more important to me than living in conflict. It's a spiritual problem in the country more than it is a political one.
And that's exactly where I was going to go with your essay. I mean, to me, it is really about a kind of spiritual crisis. And putting the issue together, I put it all the way at the back intentionally, because where the essay lands is with this moment of hope and rebirth that comes not in a small town, but in New York City, in an art museum, coming out, seeing the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island in the distance, and this kind of symbol of American immigration and rebirth through that process, and this kind of suggestion of maybe cities, not so bad. There's a lot going on there.
And when the essay ends, I'm at the Whitney Museum and I come out and I'm having a rough time. I see Ellis Island across the river and connect to that moment where my grandparents arrived with my mother. I think yearning is the thing that is what unites us. Just this yearning for more, for better. So I wanted to end the essay, like no matter how hopeless it gets, if we can maintain that capacity to yearn for the next thing and not be afraid of it and not see it as losing something, but that life is constant change. And if you can step into that and know that there's something ahead, if you keep yearning for a better tomorrow, it's always worth going. It's when we constantly feel we're losing things that we start to get hopeless, and that's when we start to get aggressive and hate each other.
Well, and that's actually where I wanted to conclude for all of you, is on this question then of exactly what we were talking about. All of the research, all the data is there to really demonstrate that one of the things that has happened in small towns is with the loss of local media and something that is covering local issues and encouraging people to think, to have that civic mind about their neighbors and not just this overarching national rhetoric and a polarized rhetoric. There's every indication that people do feel more connected to those distant arguments than they feel connected to the issues that face their neighbors and their neighborhood. And I wonder if you can each talk through that challenge. And we're all communicators. That's what we do. How do we rebuild? How do we make new narratives for, by, and about these places in ways that may counter the political rhetoric that is dividing them right now? Monica, you can solve this problem first.
Well, I think it goes back to something that Dean said earlier, which is it's really a question of resources as well. Until 5 years ago, I think my hometown had 2 local papers. So I still saw a nationalization of local politics. There was a big fight over funding of our local library. And this was the library that everyone had grown up going to. It was the library that they took their kids to for summer reading programs. And I was really shocked when they didn't support sending more tax dollars to it. And it was because just the idea of tax dollars in government had become so negative in their minds, they didn't want to fund it. And I wanted to say, this isn't the government. It's Dale, who you went to school with, and Carla, who you hired to run the library. Like, you know these people. So I feel like...
I'm sorry, that's a scene in It's a Wonderful Life. That literally happens in It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, this isn't the government. This is the people that you live next to who you have voted to do this thankless job for you of going through the county budget every week. And now you don't want to give them the money that they say they need to pay off the library building. So I think that it's partly a question of these places really do need an investment in all different kinds of ways. And I feel like if we're going to make that investment, we should ask hard questions about, should this place exist like this? Should we rethink the way it's physically built and the way people physically live in it? But I do think that how we want America to survive requires us to invest our resources, our creative energies, and money. So I think that's a huge question about the local press as well. And I think the press exists to ensure democracy. We have a First Amendment so that we continue to have an informed public to further the cause of democracy. So when I see local papers and small city papers and big city papers dying, I really worry about the future. So I think it's really a question of money first and foremost for those kinds of institutions.
I think of it as a parent, the long-term investment. I have 2 teenagers. I've always tried to teach them to look for who's vulnerable at your school and try to defend them. Doesn't mean standing up to bullies, though in some cases, my son's been suspended twice last year for doing that, and he didn't handle it perfectly. There were other options. But I do think putting an ethic into your children as to look who's struggling, look who, because they don't speak the language, because their gender identity is something that they're struggling with and trying to express in a new way. Whatever it is, don't worry about what the political issue is. Look at the human who's trying to fit in, who's trying to find a place, and welcome them. Make room at the lunch table. When someone says something stupid on Snapchat, tell the person that's dumb. That's a dumb joke. Find ways to say things that will stop the mentality. So I think of it a lot as a parent. Like, if you can teach your kids or your grandchildren, like, the toughest thing you can do is stand side by side with someone who's considered an outsider. That's the spiritual transformation. And I think also we have to empower teachers rather than restrict teachers to allow us to read widely and discuss these issues, not discuss these issues. I think it's a generational problem. And unfortunately, I feel like we've targeted children to help bolster our division. But if there can be a shift, that would be the long-term transformation, I think.
Yeah, I think about what Monica was talking about in this regard. The university where I teach is 30 minutes east of Columbus, Ohio, and we're a well-funded small liberal arts college. And not any of my own doing, but to my colleagues doing, they started a thing called the Reporting Project, where we actually have a retired former editor of the Columbus Dispatch is on faculty with us now. Connie Schultz, who won a Pulitzer Prize, is on faculty with us now, and she helps oversee some of what's going on. But we actually use students to cover local events in the community. And I think one of the things that's important, increasingly they're asked by the community to cover more events, right? But I think what's important about that and what's lost, and I know we're speaking to the converted here, but I think what's important about that is, yes, it's important for democracy, but it's also important because one of the best stories we did last year was from one of our best students who went and covered this high school basketball coach, and what a phenomenal job he was doing. But those are things that actually build community and that show, like, here's a guy who did something different that other people weren't doing and really brought his team together. It was really well done. There was a lot of care. The student was a young person. He tried really hard to make sure he got everything right, and he did it right. But I think that those are the kinds of things that we forget that papers also do that. We also had a great story that they broke where the village's recreation fund lost $750,000. And they were like, how did that happen? And they got hacked and didn't realize it for like 4 months. So they broke that story, and no one would have known about it really unless they had done that. And then the person in charge of that sheepishly asked if they could have a follow-up interview to try to correct the record a little bit. But my point about that is that when you have those small papers, what's important is that those people are also beholden to the community, and they're beholden to the citizens. I do a lot of freelance sports writing, and I was just in Pinehurst, North Carolina, and the little paper there, the Pilot, they have to cover everything. They've got this huge event coming up. The U.S. Open is going to be there. There's going to be 55,000 people in this village of 7,000 every day for a week. And the editor was saying, we're going to do this special insert, 64-page insert covering the Open every day. At the same time, we still have to cover school board meetings. We still have to cover zoning meetings. And they've only got a staff of 4. They're going to hire freelancers to do a lot of the golf coverage. But the day I met him, we met at a coffee shop, and he had to say hi to 6 people before we could sit down to talk. And I think that's where we have to get back to. They know that he's going to be tough and be fair, but they can also have a cup of coffee with him. And that's really what we're losing. The dearth of local news, to me, is like the most immediate crisis and why a lot of these things are crumbling underneath our feet. I mean, I was on an assignment last year covering this woman's kid. He was a junior golfer, and I'm there to do a story about her son. She goes, I know the media lie. I know they lie. And I was like, do you think I'm going to lie about your son? She's just been fed this line, and you got to see people. And when you don't have reporters in front of you, it's easy to believe that the county is corrupt and that I don't need to volunteer. I think those are the things that we're losing. Those kinds of institutions are more critical to building community than we think. I'd like to see us get to that point where we all see that as a public good as much as the fire department, quite honestly.
Agreed. Well, thank you all for your contributions to this issue, for the stories that you're telling about rural America and small towns, your own experiences there. I can't thank you enough for the contributions to the magazine. I hope you all will take some time to read. They're just marvelous and beautiful pieces, and it's a thrill to have you all here together with us. Thanks again for being here, and thank you all. Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper and Cass Lee at Volubility Podcasting. Special thanks to TU President Brad Carson and the Church Studio.